So my name is Anthony Hannon, and I will be your Forever Scholars moderator for today. Before we begin, I just want to mention, some of you may have heard this before if you had logged in earlier, that tonight's presentation, it is about a 45-minute lecture from Professor Gallagher, and that's followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. So if you do have questions for Professor Gallagher, please put them in the Q&A box. It helps us organize those questions. You can put them in at any point during the presentation, and we will answer them during that Q&A session at the end. Please know that sometimes we do get a lot of questions, so we may not have time to answer everyone's, but we'll do our best. And also, if you are joining throughout the presentation or you want to have a conversation, please use the chat box. It's always nice for us to read them after the presentation, and I will share that chat log with Professor Gallagher as well after the presentation. And before we get started, I just want to mention that Professor Gallagher will be teaching an upcoming class with us on Lincoln. It will be a 2-session live online starting on January 16th, 2024. The class is only $99, so we imagine that it'll probably fill up pretty quickly. So if you are interested, please register today. I'm going to drop that link to register in the chat now. Let me just pull it up. All right, I'm dropping that link now for people to register if they're interested. And without further delay, let me introduce Professor Gary W. Gallagher, who is the John L. Now III Professor of History Emeritus at the University of Virginia, where he won the university's top teaching award. Before moving to UVA, he was an archivist at the LBJ Library in Austin, Texas, for a decade, and then spent 12 years in the Department of History at Penn State University. A specialist in the field of Civil War era studies, he is the author or editor of more than 40 books. Most recently, The Enduring Civil War, Reflections on the Great American Crisis, which was in 2020. Professor, do you have a new book yet or anything in the works that you want to mention?
No, not really.
And active in the field of historic preservation, he helped co-found the first national Civil War preservation organization and has served on the advisory boards of 3 others. So thank you for joining us, Professor Gallagher. I would now like to turn it over to you to get us started.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be back and able to talk today about the 1862 Maryland campaign, and especially to look at the question of how people who experienced it at the time and watched it, read about it at the time, interpreted it as compared to how we have looked at it in retrospect. The Maryland campaign of September 1862, which featured the horrific Battle of Antietam on September 17th, ranks among the most gripping military operations of the American Civil War. Confederate General Robert E. Lee moved into Maryland on the heels of his impressive win at the Battle of Second Bull Run in late August 1862, while Major George B. McClellan recently returned to the limelight after a fumbling effort during the 7 Days campaign outside Richmond, was in Washington, D.C., trying to put together an Army of the Potomac that would confront Lee as he moved north. Lee hoped that his march into the United States would enable him to maintain the strategic initiative while also reaping a logistical bounty from Western Pennsylvania, and then he hoped from the Cumberland Valley in Pennsylvania. He and most other Confederates believed that the appearance of the Army of Northern Virginia would also embolden Marylanders to embrace the nascent Southern Republic, and maybe even a lot of men from Maryland to join the Army. They believed Maryland, a slaveholding state that had remained in the United States, was being held in the Union against its will, basically, and they viewed themselves as liberators. Confederate success on Union soil hoped many Confederates might hurt Republicans in the autumn elections in the United States, and some also hoped that success in this campaign might prompt leaders in London and Paris to move Great Britain and France toward official diplomatic recognition of the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee didn't hope that, but many in the Confederacy did. On the U.S. side, Abraham Lincoln saw Lee's invasion as both a threat and an opportunity. With elections looming in November, the Republican administration could not tolerate a rebel army north of the Potomac for very long. But Lincoln reckoned that as Lee marched farther and farther away from his Virginia sources of supply, his army would become increasingly vulnerable. The president hoped that McClellan, whose previous record included little evidence of aggressive proclivities, would make Lee pay dearly for his decision to take the war out of Virginia and into the United States. I'm sure that everyone in this audience tonight understands the sequence that unfolded rapidly. It's well known to everyone interested in the Civil War. I'll just spend a few minutes on it. He crossed the Potomac, divided his army while it was in Frederick, Maryland, which is about 45 miles north of Washington. He sent the bulk of the army under Major General Stonewall Jackson to capture Harper's Ferry and directed the remainder to march deeper into Maryland toward Hagerstown. Lee would accompany that second part of the army. Shortly thereafter, leaving Frederick, a copy of his blueprint for the entire campaign, contained in Special Orders number 191, fell into McClellan's hands, an incredible piece of good luck for McClellan. And McClellan actually bestirred himself to press the invaders. While Jackson laid siege to Harper's Ferry, McClellan's army forced Lee's defenders out of the gaps in South Mountain, east of Frederick, in sharp fighting on September 14th. Lee briefly thought about withdrawing back to Virginia, but then he decided to concentrate his army near Sharpsburg, a village just across the Potomac River in Maryland, near the western slope of South Mountain and about 18 miles north of Harper's Ferry. McClellan let 2 days go by, the 15th and 16th, without pushing harder against Lee. But Harper's Ferry and its 12,500 defenders surrendered to Jackson on the 15th. That freed Jackson to hasten to Lee's support. This surrender in Harper's Ferry was the second largest of United States troops in all of our history. Only the loss of the Philippines in 1942 yielded more U.S. POWs. It's a major surrender in Harper's Ferry. The climactic clash of the campaign, as you all know, came on the 17th of September at Antietam, which produced more than 23,000 casualties in the war's bloodiest single day in United States history. That's killed, wounded, and missing, 23,000. The armies remained on the battlefield to glower at one another for another tense day on the 18th, after which McClellan permitted Lee to escape back across the Potomac River in a single night, unmolested. A Federal thrust across the river at Shepherdstown late on September 19th, Shepherdstown is just a few miles from Sharpsburg, gained some temporary success, but a Confederate counterattack by Major General A.P. Hill's division on the 20th drove the Federals back to the left bank of the Potomac. And the Maryland campaign sputtered to a conclusion during the remainder of September and October. The strategic frontier remained along the Potomac River, with Lee maneuvering in the lower Shenandoah Valley, that is the northeastern part of the Shenandoah Valley, gathering food and fodder from the region and striking at the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, that major east-west rail link in the United States that dipped below the Potomac for just a few miles at Harper's Ferry. Despite Lincoln's best efforts to prod him into action, McClellan mounted no major effort to get at the rebels. He let the rest of September go by, and then week by week, October went by as well. Not until November, when Lincoln replaced McClellan with Major General Ambrose E. Burnside, did the war in the Eastern Theater take on a more active character. By then, important results of the Maryland campaign had become evident to people on both sides. Neither side had won a clear-cut military decision in Maryland. The surrender of 12,500 Union soldiers at Harper's Ferry galled the North and cheered the Confederacy. The vicious tactical stalemate at Antietam took on the nature of a Union victory when Lee retreated back across the Potomac. And Lincoln determined that Lee's withdrawal justified the issuance on September 22nd, 5 days after the battle, of his preliminary Proclamation of Emancipation, an act with enormous implications for the future direction of the war. Both sides also knew that Marylanders had not rallied to the Confederate cause, and neither had the governments of Great Britain and France taken steps to intervene in the American war. They came sort of close to intervening in some way at almost exactly the same time as the Battle of Antietam, but Lee's retreat caused them to draw back. People in the United States and in the Confederacy understood all too well that the war would continue. This wasn't going to be a decisive battle in that regard. And all people watching events in the Eastern Theater soon would be digesting news about the Battle of Fredericksburg in mid-December 1862. Historians typically have assessed the Maryland campaign from the perspective of its long-term impact. Looking back with later events in mind, they label it a major turning point that foreshadowed Confederate defeat. They argue that it arrested Confederate momentum in the Eastern Theater in the fall of '62, forestalled foreign recognition of the Confederacy, reversed a disastrous decline in morale in the Union Army and among Union civilians early that fall, and offered Lincoln the opportunity to present his preliminary proclamation. He decided to present one in the wake of the 7 days, but now he had his chance to do it. In a war with several crucial turning points, the Battle of Antietam often is put forward as the most crucial of them all. Students of the Civil War and of history more generally love to look for turning points. Turning points are fun. It's fun to argue about turning points. What is the greatest turning point? I mean, most people think it's Gettysburg. That's not correct, but that's what most people think. I gave a lecture in this same series last year about Gettysburg and how we should view it as a turning point. It's most often put forward, sometimes in tandem with Vicksburg in July of 1863, as the most famous turning point of the war. But probably the second most popular turning point is the Maryland Campaign and Battle of Antietam in 1862. Sometimes people will lump it together with Braxton Bragg's movement into Kentucky at about the same time that Lee moved into Maryland. Bragg retreated from Kentucky after the Battle of Perryville in October, as Lee had retreated earlier from Maryland. They put those two together and see that as the end of a turning point. Almost all efforts to identify turning points are predicated on a post facto reading of the war that assumes United States victory. Analysis that starts at Appomattox, reads backward, knowing everything that we know, looking for points at which it seemed to become inevitable that the Confederacy would triumph or that Lee and his army would have to surrender. All the things that ended up happening and that we know now ended up happening. I want to shift our focus tonight away from that way of trying to gauge the importance of the campaign in Maryland. I understand the desire to highlight the broad implications of the Maryland campaign, which they seem so obvious to us now. We can look at it and say, well, clearly this was a great turning point. But looking at it that way leaves another question largely unaddressed and certainly unanswered. Namely, how did Americans at the time react? Americans in the United States, Americans in the Confederacy. Was it seen by them, the campaign of Maryland, as a watershed that likely determined who would emerge triumphant at the end of the war? In other words, tonight, we're going to read forward in the evidence, knowing no more than people knew in the autumn of 1862, rather than reading backward, knowing everything that we know. And I'll confess at this point that there's so much written evidence from participants in the Civil War that it is possible to argue almost anything and to cite actual sources. You don't have to make up sources. You can have real footnotes that people can look at that will allow you to support almost any argument that you want to make. The key is to represent the preponderance of the evidence fairly, and that's what I'm going to try to do from here on out. All the quotations that I'm going to offer are from September, October, or November 1862. That's actually not true. I'm going to offer one from early 1863. But no lost cause, special pleading, or second guessing, no post-war revisionism. We're going to try to assess how people at the time made sense of what had happened in Maryland. Examined within the context of what people read and heard at the time, and freed from the powerful influence of historical hindsight, the impact of Antietam assumes a very complicated character. History is really complicated, and this is no outlier in that regard. I'm going to cite just a handful of accounts, but each one of them represents a type of testimony. Many more quotations of very similar types could be mustered in each instance. And I'm going to start with the United States. Let's see how this campaign resonated in the United States first, where newspapers, for the most part, did not paint an overly enthusiastic picture of what George B. McClellan had accomplished. Newspapers is how most people got their news, of course, in the mid-19th century. Americans, both sides of the Potomac, were avid readers of newspapers, and the papers, there were so many papers, they reached everyone, and that coverage tells us a lot about what was going on. There is very little sense of a grand turning point in the Northern coverage of the Maryland campaign. Though Democratic papers tended to be more sympathetic to Little Mac, to George B. McClellan, a staunch Democrat himself, than did the Republican newspapers. Not a surprise. George W. Smalley of the New York Tribune, a Republican paper, had the first and most influential coverage of the battle. Smalley thought the battle had been only a partial Union success, not really a victory for McClellan, but on balance favorable to the United States. Charles C. Coffin of the Boston Journal, whose account came out on September 24th, and it's especially influential because a special edition of his account was republished in the Baltimore American and disseminated among United States soldiers. At any rate, this account said, quote, "Present evidence is not sufficient to warrant any definite conclusion whether the battle was to us a victory or a defeat. It will probably be classed as a great indecisive engagement." The New York Daily Tribune on September 26th published a letter from a correspondent written from Harper's Ferry. This letter referred to September 18th, the day after Antietam, the day Lee stayed on the field, as that fatal Thursday which witnessed the clean, leisurely escape of the foe down the valley, across the difficult ford, and up to the Virginia Heights. There was only one ford across the river available to Robert E. Lee. That could have made his retreat much more complicated. It's only Boteler's Ford near Shepherdstown that was an avenue for him to get away. This idea of a lost opportunity to deal a decisive blow to Lee's battered army, far more than any claims of a grand turning point, characterized much of the Union newspaper reaction to the campaign. Key members of the Lincoln administration echoed the theme of lost opportunity. Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, whose diary is a treasure trove of information on the Lincoln administration, noted glumly on September 19th, quote, "Nothing from the Army except that instead of following up the victory, attacking and capturing the rebels, they, the rebels, after a day's armistice, are rapidly escaping across the river." McClellan says they are crossing and that Pleasanton is after them. That's Alfred Pleasanton. And Welles closed his entry with, "Oh dear," exclamation point. 4 days later, Welles had become even more discouraged, writing that he had heard, quote, "no news from the Army. The rebels appear to be moving back into Virginia in their own time and way, to select their own resting place, and to do so, in short, pretty much as they please. I am sick, sad, and sorrowful over this state of affairs." Secretary of the Treasury Salmon P. Chase also expressed disappointment at McClellan's failure to inflict a more crushing defeat on Lee. On September 22nd, the day that Lincoln announced his preliminary proclamation, Chase approved of that measure. Chase was an abolitionist, but wished there'd been a greater victory to set the stage. "The action of the Army against the rebels has not been quite what I should have best liked," he recorded in his journal. And 2 days earlier, Chase had written to Senator John Sherman of Ohio even more pessimistically. "Well, the rebel army is withdrawn from Maryland. That is something, but far less than was anticipated. We'd hoped it would not be permitted to withdraw except in flight and utter demoralization. It is in fact, however, today strongly, relatively stronger than our own army." So both Chase and Welles in the cabinet are very disappointed. Lincoln's own profound sense of lost opportunity is too well known to detail. He had hoped for more decisive results in Maryland, and most especially more in the way of an aggressive pursuit as Lee's battered army marched away from the battlefield. Lee had lost a third of his entire army during the fighting on September 17th. He had about 35,000 men on the field and lost more than 10,000 of them. On October 13th, the president scarcely concealed his frustration in a letter to McClellan. You remember my speaking to you of what I called your overcautiousness. Are you not overcautious when you assume that you cannot do what the enemy is constantly doing? Should you not claim to be at least his equal in prowess, excuse me, and act upon that claim? Many soldiers within the Army of the Potomac joined Lincoln in expressing frustration that Lee had gotten away. An officer in the 10th Massachusetts Infantry wrote edgily on September 19th, I see the news begins to grow less favorable to our side in the late battles. At first, they were going to bag the whole rebel army. Now they are driven back into Virginia, which is not the place to bag them by a long shot. And tomorrow, I presume, we shall hear the rebels have bagged McClellan and his army. Or perhaps not until Monday, he closed with a little bit of sarcasm. Robert Gould Shaw, a junior officer at Antietam, we all know he would die at the head of the 54th Massachusetts, assaulting Battery Wagner in July 1863, the regiment from Glory. He employed understatement to say about the same thing as this first person I quoted. Shaw wrote to his father, it was the greatest fight of the war. The enemy have started across the river, and McClellan will follow, I suppose. The result of the battle was that we remained in possession of the field, and the enemy drew off undisturbed. Whether that is all we wanted, I don't know, but I should think not, said Shaw. Daniel M. Holt was a federal surgeon who minced no words in a September 25th letter to his wife. We ought to have utterly routed and destroyed their army, but no, exclamation point. Instead of a decided, brilliant victory and the end of the war, we have a doubtful victory, and the enemy left to recruit at will and prolong the war almost indefinitely. If there's a turning point in Holt's letter, it turns the wrong way for the United States. I'll give a soldier in the 15th Massachusetts the last word from the Army. This is Private Roland E. Bowen, who survived the maelstrom in the West Woods that butchered 318 of the 606 men in his regiment. He summarized the battle in a letter to his uncle dated October 7th. Both parties fought with a desperation. Both parties wavered at times. Each side slew the other by thousands. Now both sides claim a monstrous victory. Question, who was victorious? Answer, neither. Overall, I think Union soldiers typically took pride in their performance, claimed local success by virtue of the rebel retreat, and in some cases cautiously hoped for an end to the war. But few saw Antietam as a clear harbinger of Northern success. Beyond the question of whether the battle was decisive militarily, Lincoln's preliminary proclamation failed to inspire many soldiers to make positive predictions about its impact on the conflict. Many agreed with Robert Gould Shaw's sentiment that the proclamation wouldn't make any difference. Shaw said, wherever the Union Army goes, slavery ends. Wherever it doesn't go, slavery stays intact. Doesn't matter what the president says. What matters is what the Army does. Others departed from Shaw, almost all Democrats did, in railing against Lincoln's preliminary proclamation. They warned that white soldiers would never fight for emancipation. They were fighting a war for union. They were not willing to fight a war to free Black people. And in a broader way, the proclamation seemed to threaten the unity of the United States war effort, causing an uproar behind the lines among millions of white Northerners who would fight a war for union, mainly Democrats, but hated the idea of risking white lives for Black freedom. In time, freedom would be placed more solidly on the Union agenda, but no one in the autumn of 1862 knew that the war would last long enough to do that, or that in fact that would become part of the fabric of the conflict. Let me finish my brief survey of reactions on the US side with a couple of witnesses in New York City. One is Republican lawyer George Templeton Strong, who kept one of the great diaries in American history. He betrayed sarcasm and pessimism in his assessment 5 weeks after Antietam. Our war on the rebellion languishes, he wrote. We make no onward movements and gain no victories. McClellan's repose is doubtless majestic, but if a couchant lion postpone his spring too long, people will begin wondering whether he is not a stuffed specimen after all. He predicted that if there wasn't strong movement against Lee quickly, that New York State would go against the Republican Party in the autumn of 1862. Maria Leidig Daley was a staunch Democrat, the wife of a Democratic judge in New York. Even she had harsh opinions about McClellan, the Democratic general. McClellan is wanting in good generalship, she wrote on September 28. He stands idly on this side of the Potomac whilst Lee is recruiting and furnishing himself in Virginia. Another winter campaign, she wrote with frustration, is before us. All right, what about reaction on the other side of the Potomac? As the autumn weeks went by, Confederates groped toward a rough consensus about Antietam and the Maryland campaign as a whole. It can be summed up briefly. The conclusion was the campaign did not represent a major setback for the Confederacy. Antietam was at worst a bloody standoff, at best a narrow tactical success for Confederates who beat back heavy Union assaults and maintained their position for another whole day. Stonewall Jackson's capture of the 12,500 soldiers at Harper's Ferry was talked about a great deal in Confederate newspapers, and to a lesser degree, so also was A.P. Hill's repulse of the Union soldiers at Shepherdstown on September the 20th. The Confederate papers talked a lot about McClellan's inaction throughout late September and into October. They said that showed his army must have really been damaged, or he would have followed Lee more aggressively. And Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, considered most rebel editors, showed a Republican desperation, a hope to do something to turn around a war effort that was losing, and they predicted that it would actually hurt sentiment in the United States in the long term. They were reconciled, most of these editors were, to the fact that the war was not going to end anytime soon, but they thought that on the whole, prospects looked propitious for the Confederates going forward. In one important respect, the Maryland campaign served as the coda to a different kind of Confederate watershed than most historians have described, and this is really a very important one. Lee and his army emerged from Maryland as a major rallying point for the Confederacy. Their operations between July and September 1862, which encompassed the victories at the 7 Days and Second Bull Run, and then the movement into Maryland, began a process that within another 8 months would make them the focus, Lee and his army, the focus of Confederate national morale, would make them the most important national institution in the Confederacy. Better attuned to Confederate sentiment than many later historians would be, Edward A. Pollard of the Richmond Examiner touched on this point, writing in early 1863. This is my one 1863 quotation. He wrote, "The army which rested again in Virginia had made a history that will flash down the tide of time in a luster of glory. The remarkable campaign extending from the banks of the James River to those of the Potomac," concluded Pollard, "impressed the world with wonder and admiration." He treated this as one massive campaign that stretched from late June 1862 to the end of September 1862, rather than breaking it up into its constituent pieces. As in the North, newspapers supplied most Confederates outside Lee's army with their initial impressions, and Southern editors typically took the stance that Antietam ranked among the bitterest engagements of the war, and that while not perhaps a clear Confederate victory, put on exhibit tremendous Confederate military prowess. They also stressed, as I said earlier, that McClellan didn't pursue Lee, didn't drive him from the field. First of all, Lee's army stayed another whole day. That's a bigger deal than we might imagine it now, but then didn't pursue him after that. And then they also made a huge deal out of the fall of Harper's Ferry. And I'll quote just a couple here. 6 days after the battle, Charleston's Mercury termed the fighting on September 17th the most bloody and desperately contested of the whole war, in which the outnumbered Confederate army, quote, illustrated its valor and invincibility by successfully repelling the repeated onsets of the enemy. Richmond's Dispatch, which had the largest circulation among the capital's newspapers, took an even more optimistic view. "It's evident that we were victorious on Wednesday, the 17th. We acted on the defensive. The enemy tried a whole day to drive us from our position, but utterly failed. We held our position and slept on the ground, ready to renew the contest on the next day. Now, the newspapers did concede that there'd been terrible straggling within the Confederate Army, an evil that by Lee's own estimate had infected between 1/3 and 1/2 of his force. He crossed the Potomac the first week of September with about 55,000 men. He only had 35,000 at Antietam. 20,000 Confederate soldiers were not present in the fighting at Antietam. And although the editors deplored the absence of the stragglers at Antietam, most of them sort of explained it away by saying that they were simply lacking in supplies and broke down and couldn't keep up. A correspondent from the Savannah Republican got at the kind of language that many of them used. He wrote this: "A fifth of the troops are barefooted, half of them are in rags, and the whole of them insufficiently supplied with food." He wrote this on September 19th. "The best soldiers under such circumstances will straggle on the march and in battle." Many of the editors said that if these men had been present at Antietam, it would have been a decisive win for the Confederates. Southern editors also paid attention, and so did Southern civilians. Both sides read the other's newspapers, and they gleaned a lot of information from Northern newspapers that made them even more optimistic about the outcome of the campaign. The Richmond Whig touched on themes repeated in many other Southern newspapers. Northern papers such as the New York Times and the New York Tribune observed the Richmond Whig no longer even claimed Antietam as a victory. For McClellan, indeed, many of them, said the Whig, deny outright that it was a federal victory at all. The Whig also stressed other points. They stressed the same ones that I've been talking about. Lee's men occupied the field on the 18th, withdrew in good order, got across the Potomac River, and then were not pursued. Southern papers also gleaned from Northern papers a good deal of unhappiness about Lincoln's preliminary proclamation, and that it made Confederates take heart. The preliminary proclamation evoked generally optimistic reactions from across the Confederacy because of this. This seems odd to us now. How could they so misinterpret something that we know in the long term, the proclamation, would hurt the Confederacy's ability to maintain the war? But that is not how they looked at it then. They read Northern newspapers and really believed that the Northern civilian population, as well as the men in the ranks, were badly divided over the issue of emancipation, especially Democrats. Southern papers insisted that weakness arising from indifferent performances on the battlefield had forced Lincoln to issue the proclamation, a sort of desperate effort on his part. One editor stated, "The South rejoices in the publication of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. It breeds division in his own borders. It will compose differences and produce greater unanimity throughout these Confederate states." And that point was accurate. The Emancipation Proclamation did produce stronger resolution in the Confederacy because now the entire slaveholding society was going to be on the table, and United States victory might mean the end of all the benefits to white people that Confederates saw from the institution of slavery. Well, Confederate civilians read all these newspaper accounts. They also read letters from soldiers in the armies, and they plotted the positions of armies on maps and reached their own conclusions by mid-October. A few of them decided the invasion had been a mistake, but the majority seemed to fall, not seemed, they fell on the positive side of the scales in taking in the overall record of Lee's army between June and the end of September. And they entered the late fall and looked toward the winter of 1863 with what I would call a guarded optimism about Confederate prospects. I'll come back to Jackson's success at Harper's Ferry again. This stood out in the letters and diaries of civilians on the home front, and it helped offset any doubts about Lee's eventual retreat. Remember, the 12,500 soldiers that Jackson captured at Harper's Ferry, that's the same number that McClellan's army suffered in casualties in the Battle of Antietam. 12,500, 12,500. So the Confederates they would have said, this is really 25,000 casualties, not 12,500. Harper's Ferry, I'll say one last time, loomed much larger then than it does now in people's assessments of the Maryland campaign. They also liked the fact that when Harper's Ferry fell, a lot of African Americans who made their way to Union lines and freedom in the late summer and early autumn of 1862 were recaptured by Confederates. A lot of diaries and letters talk about that too. This is a good thing, an ancillary benefit of Harper's Ferry falling. And they also like to talk about the fight at Shepherdstown and to really play up the fact that Union casualties there were high. They exaggerated the casualties, but they believed them and had accounts of untold Union bodies floating down toward Washington, falling into the Potomac River and then floating down toward Washington. They were unhappy about Maryland's anemic response to the Confederate invasion. The Confederate Army had played Maryland, My Maryland, as they went into Maryland, had seen themselves as liberators. That was one of the great patriotic songs in the Confederacy for about a year. The despot's heel is on thy shore, Maryland, my Maryland, you know the lyrics. Well, they didn't play that song on their way out of Maryland because the Marylanders had not turned out to support the Army in Northern Virginia. The Army was in Western Maryland. There aren't many slaveholders in Western Maryland. If they'd been over near Baltimore, they would have had a lot more friendly Marylanders to greet them, but they didn't have them where they were. And people across the Confederacy really believed that Maryland had let them down. I'll quote one woman who wrote in this vein. She said, "Our army returned to Virginia after the battle at Sharpsburg. They were unprepared for an advance into Pennsylvania and could not be sustained in that unfriendly part of Maryland." Most Confederates seem to have emulated their newspaper editors in viewing the Emancipation Proclamation the way they've already talked about, that it was on balance going to be something good for the Confederacy. I'll quote Catherine Devereux Edmonston, who was a woman who lived in Eastern North Carolina and kept a really great diary. It's the best published diary by any woman who lived in the Confederacy. It's titled Journal of a Secesh Lady. I recommend it to anyone who's interested in women's accounts. She sat in her home in Eastern North Carolina, read newspapers, read letters, scrutinized the war, and she wrote, "Evidences of division at home appear in the Northern journals. The Emancipation Proclamation meets with some bitter opponents, and McClellan is like to have a fire in his rear." Pennsylvania-born Josiah Gorgas, the Confederacy's brilliant ordnance chief, recorded in his diary that Lincoln's action triggered, quote, "marked opposition at the North, and is denounced by the Democrats generally." So a fairly strong, favorable reaction to what the influence of the Emancipation Proclamation might be. Confederates were especially happy to hear about unhappy Union soldiers who complained about the Emancipation Proclamation. One man who had been reading Union newspapers wrote in in early October, "General McClellan has issued a mild general order cautioning the troops against political discussion. It is a very significant production and goes to corroborate the report that great trouble exists in Yankee camps on account of the war becoming one for the abolition of slavery." Well, Jefferson Davis almost certainly took a more pessimistic view of the Maryland campaign than did a majority of his people. Robert Garlick Hill Kane, who was the head of the Confederate Bureau of War, recorded a famous description of Davis in his diary, of Davis's mood in his diary. He was very low down after the Battle of Sharpsburg. "The Secretary of War told me that the president said our maximum strength had been laid out, while the enemy was but beginning to put forth his." I think that Lee's oldest son, George Washington Custis Lee, had an influence on Davis in this regard. Custis was a colonel at this point. He'd later be a major general. He's a colonel at this point, and he's on Jefferson Davis's staff. He went to Martinsburg, young Lee did, in late September, and reported that the officers told him, quote, "Our troops were shaky from the day they went into Maryland. The worst of it," he concluded, Custis Lee, "is that the enemy can refit faster than we can." Well, that's very close to how Kane described Jefferson Davis's attitude. The soldiers in the Army in Northern Virginia knew better than anyone else what they had endured, and their letters and diaries evaluated the various components of the Maryland campaign, shed light on the physical condition and morale in the Army, judged the quality of the Army's leaders, and speculated about the likely short and long-term direction of the war. Men and officers alike described Antietam as a cataclysmic battle that had pushed them to the breaking point. But virtually all their accounts stressed that Lee's battered units held the field. I'm coming back to this again. The emphasis on maintaining ground might seem like a transparent effort to deflect attention away from the Army of Northern Virginia's eventual defeat. However, for Civil War soldiers, the ability to avoid being driven from the field carried enormous psychological weight. Confederates would do the same thing after Gettysburg 10 months later. They took pride in overcoming disadvantages of ground, of numbers, a huge disadvantage in artillery. The Union artillery at Antietam had been overwhelmingly more powerful. The Confederate gunners referred to Antietam as artillery hell. These Confederates, in the wake of the battle, said that despite all of that, they couldn't break us with all their attacks. We stayed on the field another whole day, and we got across the river in good condition. I'm going to quote just three Confederates, to give you a sense of the Confederate soldiers' reactions. This is a private in the 13th Mississippi. "The fight raged all day with great fury," he wrote. "It was indeed a frightful scene and looked as if we would be completely annihilated, but we drove them back with great loss." He admitted heavy Confederate losses as well, but said it was nothing to compare with that of the enemy. And he closed his letter, "We slept on the battlefield last night." An officer on Stonewall Jackson's staff told his uncle that it had been the greatest battle of the war that we fought, at least the longest. "We repulsed the enemy with heavy loss, and he was too crippled to renew the attack the next day, though we waited and invited him to do so." A member of the 56th Virginia considered the battle the grandest of the war, perhaps the grandest ever fought. And he captured the ebb and flow of the fighting in language much like that of Private Bowen of the 15th Massachusetts. "Sometimes the enemy drove us, sometimes we drove the enemy. He made a desperate effort to dislodge us from our position, but failed most signally. Some of us counted a drawn battle, others claim it as a great victory." This soldier also emphasized, "We stayed on the field a whole day after the battle." The men disagreed about how to characterize the retreat. Some were more chastened than others, but none of them saw it as really a precipitate departure from Maryland. And many of them, when they made their final assessments of the campaign, treated it as the third act in a grand drama of three acts that had begun with the 7 days, continued through Second Bull Run, and then gone on through the campaign into Maryland. This was a way that a number of people in the Confederacy looked at it. They said that between June and September, the Army in Northern Virginia had earned spectacular victories at the 7 days and Second Bull Run, and then carried the war into the United States. The war had been taking place in the Confederacy before then, and these feats helped cancel the effects of defeats in other theaters. The retreat from Maryland, counterbalanced by Harper's Ferry and to a lesser degree Shepherdstown, did not detract appreciably from the laurels the Army had earned at Richmond with the 7 days and Second Bull Run. In the space of less than 3 months, the men in the Army and the Confederate people had come to expect good news from the Army of Northern Virginia, investing ever more emotional capital in its leaders and soldiers. And in this important respect, the Maryland campaign, as I've already said, did function as the final element in a 3-month-long turning point, one that in the minds of many Confederates enhanced rather than diminished the likelihood that they would prove successful in establishing their slaveholder republic. Just keep situations at 2 points in mind to understand what they're doing here. The end of June 1862, the war had gone to hell in the West for Confederates. Shiloh, Fort Donelson, Nashville had fallen, Memphis had fallen, the great port of New Orleans had fallen. There was a Union army in Corinth, Mississippi of 100,000 men. And meanwhile, the largest army of the Republic, the Army of the Potomac, was 5 miles from the Confederate capital with an O, not an A, in Richmond. The war seemed to be about loss. Fast forward to the end of October, and you have, where's the war now? It's not around Richmond. It's not around Fredericksburg. The frontier is back to the Potomac River. The war has been completely reoriented in this period. And it is those two snapshots, put those side by side, and you can understand why so many Confederates interpreted this as one big and largely very successful campaign. Well, let me close with just a few final thoughts. I believe that only a handful of Northerners would have counted Antietam as the type of watershed that so many modern Americans describe. I say a handful. I didn't find a single one, but there were lots of people whose reactions, of course, I didn't read. Very few would have said that. For many Confederates, it represented the kind of watershed that I've mentioned, this different kind of watershed relating to Lee and the Army in Northern Virginia. I can say for absolute certain that in the grim summer of 1864, when everything seemed to tremble in the balance, it's the lowest point of the war for the United States, as Lee and U.S. Grant faced off in Virginia, and as William Tecumseh Sherman maneuvered and fought to capture Atlanta, few, if any, people in either the United States or the Confederacy would have said that Antietam had foreordained Union victory. By then, Antietam was little more than a receding memory. The 1862 Maryland campaign affords a perfect example of the very different meanings that events can have for those who experience them firsthand and for those who later try to make sense of them. That's about 40. Well, I ran a minute over, but we still have time. We have 14 or 15 minutes for questions. So what have we got, Anthony?
So we have quite a few, and I will just say if anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we will try to get to all of them. But I'm not going to waste time. I'm going to just start right away because we've got a bunch. Mark wants to know, A.P. Hill's arrival on the scene saved Lee's army. Would the war have ended that day if Hill had not arrived when he did? And interesting note, his Mark's great-grandfather was in Branch's brigade under Hill.
Lawrence O'Brien Branch, who didn't have a good day at Antietam because he got killed. Anyway, yes, A.P. Hill did save the army at Antietam. And yes, Lee was absolutely on the ropes. I don't think Lee should have stayed north of the Potomac. I think there was nothing for him to gain at Antietam. He was badly outnumbered. His army was in terrible shape, as I've talked about. This is an example of his really fundamentally pugnacious approach to being a general. A.P. Hill saved the army by pushing his division on that 18-mile march from Harper's Ferry to the battlefield, pushed it so hard that half of them fell out of the ranks. They only got there with about 2,500 men, but they came in at just the right point, at just the right time, and staved off a disastrous ending to the day. The Federals were about to get control of the road to Bowler's Ford. And if they had gotten control of that, they would have isolated Lee's army north of the Potomac. And I think it was one of the few times during the war when one major army had a legitimate chance, literally, to destroy another major army. A.P. Hill saved Lee's bacon, so to speak, at Antietam.
Interesting. Thank you. So next question, Mike, he wanted to know, has the recently found Elliott burial map changed any thoughts on how the battle was fought?
Yeah, hasn't changed any of my thoughts. I mean, I sort of confirms, I think, what we have known pretty well. Antietam is such a wonderful battlefield. Those of you who've been there know this. I mean, it's very easy to grasp what was going on at Antietam. You can see 2/3 of it from many places. You can't see if you're down by Burnside's Bridge on that end of the battlefield, you can't. But I haven't seen anything from that really surprised me. Didn't see anything that would make me change a lecture about Antietam.
Great, thank you. Next question, Gary. He just wanted to know what your thoughts on Ambrose Bierce, if you know who that is.
well, Ambrose Bierce wasn't at Antietam. My thoughts about Ambrose Bierce are that I love to read Ambrose Bierce. He's a contrarian. His Devil's Dictionary is one of my favorite kind of sarcastic books that anyone's ever written. And he wrote with his fiction after the war in a very realistic way and kind of graphically realistic way about the war. Lots of gore, lots of awful wounds, lots of awful stuff. He's sort of the fiction equivalent of Frank Wilkeson, who was actually in the ranks. But I have to admit that I like Bierce. He kind of suits my temperament in some ways, not every way.
Well, I'm going to combine a few questions about McClellan's, so we'll condense these into,
because there's a few. Here we go.
All right. So John wanted to know, did McClellan's disagreement with the Emancipation Proclamation perhaps contribute to his delay in October? into October. And then Richard wanted to know if McClellan had destroyed the ANV and captured Richmond, would that have ended the war 1862 and would slavery have remained legal?
Oh, good. That's just two. Okay, first of all, let's do the second one first. I think George McClellan had two opportunities to essentially end the war. And because he was so timid, he didn't do it either time. He absolutely should have done it during the 7 days. He was in a position to do it. He had the momentum, he had the advantage, and then he absolutely lost his will to continue the offensive, retreated to the James, and allowed Lee to win the 7 days battle. The 7 days battle should have been a United States victory. And if they had been a United States victory, I believe the war would have ended, because the Confederate effort in the West, as I've already said, was in a shambles. This would have been leaving the Confederate effort in the East in a shambles. He would have captured the city of Richmond, and the war would have ended, and it would have, emancipation was not on the table yet. The reason it really got on the table was because of the 7 days. It's McClellan's failure at the 7 days that resulted in quick order in the Second Confiscation Act that came out in mid-July, and in Lincoln's talking to his cabinet on the 22nd of July, saying, we're going to have to fight a harder kind of war. It's going to have to include emancipation. That's because McClellan didn't take Richmond. So yes, McClellan absolutely should have won that campaign. He didn't, and it had unbelievable consequences. Did he drag his feet because he wasn't on board about emancipation? No, he dragged his feet because he dragged his feet. That's what George B. McClellan did. George B. McClellan wanted everything to be perfect before he did anything, which is kind of a 7-year-old's approach to life. I mean, any adult knows that everything isn't ever perfect. So if you're going to wait for things to be perfect, you'll never do anything. And that's basically George McClellan's way. I think McClellan had two breathtaking opportunities in 1862 to inflict catastrophic defeats on the Confederacy. One in Richmond, one at Antietam. He didn't do either one. He broke through Lee's center at Antietam when the Confederates abandoned the sunken road. Lee's army was there to be taken, and McClellan did not do it. He had reserves. He had the whole Fifth Corps there. He didn't commit the. I won't go. I'll just say, I can't speak in strong enough terms about how much I think McClellan lost in terms of opportunities. Having said that, the fact that he didn't finish things off at Richmond put emancipation on the table. And so put that in and put Lee in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia, which essentially extended the war for 3 years, which is what made certain that emancipation, if it was going to be on the table, would only come at the end of a long war.
Interesting. And just to stay on the topic of McClellan, did McClellan ever reveal after the war why he didn't push for the assaults and finish Lee that day? Or was it just more excuses? And then also,
he blamed everybody else. He blamed his friend Ambrose Burnside. McClellan's a perfect example of nothing is ever his fault. He's the antithesis of both Grant and Lee in this regard. They did something wrong, they immediately took credit. Something went wrong with McClellan, he immediately blamed someone else. And here he threw Burnside under the bus. Burnside didn't have a great day at Antietam, but he didn't have nearly as bad a day as McClellan did. So it's no one's fault but McClellan's. It's McClellan's, and I will not let him off the hook at Antietam. He took himself off the hook, of course. Said he fought the battle splendidly. It was a work of art. He actually said that. Talk about someone with no self-awareness. He had a blank self-awareness slate in his brain. Absolutely no self-awareness.
Interesting.
That's the end of my rant about McClellan.
It was a very interesting, very good rant. So going away from McClellan, Timothy wanted to know, was there significant cavalry action at the Maryland campaign? He knows that J.E.B. Stuart often played a vital role.
Right. Not really. I mean, Stuart had his greatest moment in a raid in October. He got another high point and lots of attention with a raid conducted in October. I mean, Stuart did a good job at Antietam, and especially his artillery did a good job on the far Confederate left in the morning phase of the battle. He had guns on Nicodemus Heights, which was a great piece of high ground the Federals should have taken control of, and they didn't. And the Confederate horse artillery up there did a very good job in the morning's fighting. But for the most part, he did his job of screening and so forth. But the cavalry didn't really loom large in the Maryland campaign. Stuart had his little spike of attention and accomplishment in October with his Chambersburg raid.
So there's a question from Richard. Well, not two parts, but some background on his question. So his initial question is, what influenced the armies to consider that holding the field constituted a victory, and were the armies too heavily influenced by the Napoleonic era?
Well, they're certainly influenced by, I mean, Napoleon he's the big dude, of course, in terms of famous captains from the past. And he's an aggressive guy, but they weren't taught that. I mean, the West Pointers took almost no courses on military history or military strategy, anything like that at West Point. It's an engineering school. It's not really devoted to teaching great lessons from the military history of the past. In terms of why is it so important to hold the field, all I can know is what they write. What they wrote is that affirmed their valor and their sense of purpose and their bravery to say that in the face of, and the Federals did it too, it's not just Confederates, just we're talking about the Confederate example here. We were hammered and battered by a powerful enemy, and we held the ground. And not only did we hold it on the 17th, we stayed a whole extra day and invited them to attack us again, and they didn't even attack us. And then we got back across the river and they still didn't attack us. So we must have really damaged them by all that strong work we did on the day when we held the field. That's basically their attitude there. There's a large component of just their sense of worth as soldiers tied up in this. I think they're not being driven from the field. They're holding a position in difficult circumstances. And of course, I mean, there's a sense of notions of masculinity, of course, would tie into that, all kinds of things, and pride in your group and in the soldiers who fight on either side of you. All of those would be components of that. But what is unquestionable, I think, is that it really was important to them because they talk about it all the time, all the time.
So let's just shift perspectives quick. So there's a lot of questions about the Southern side, Confederate side. So Ron said that he knows that Southern editors and the home front addressed the Emancipation Proclamation, but for the true soldier in the field, how much of that was a focus and or the political situation?
Well, you mean, are the soldiers marching into battle thinking, boy, this is going to settle the fate of slavery? Absolutely not. No, Confederates aren't doing it, and neither are Federals. They are overwhelmingly, the majority of Union soldiers with blue uniforms, would say that the main point of the war is to save the Union. Then they would have disagreed about where slavery should fit into that, but the overwhelming goal is to save the Union. Confederates were Confederates in favor of slavery? Overwhelmingly, they were. Sure, they were. And not just slaveholders. Non-slaveholders had a stake in slavery as well, because it was a means of racial control, not just labor control. But they're not. As they march northward, the soldiers in the Army, the Potomac, or Army in Northern Virginia, are not saying, "Boy, this is going to settle the fate of slavery. I'm sure glad we can defend slavery this way." And the Union soldiers that went with McClellan to push the Confederates out of Maryland weren't. That's not what they were really talking about either. I mean, they'll discuss it. They had ideas about it. It's not the main thing on their minds.
Interesting. And to kind of bounce off of that, your answer, Thomas said that he's been reading When Hell Came to Sharpsburg and noted that there was a pretty good number of slaves in the area in Sharpsburg. And he wanted to know why there was such a tepid level of support for the Confederacy given this.
Well, there were actually relatively few slaves in the area around Sharpsburg compared to the parts of Maryland that had the highest incidence of slaveholding. The farther west you get in Maryland, the more Germans there are, the fewer large slaveholders there are. So there were relatively few. There were enslaved people there, but there were not large numbers of them. Lee's army did grab some of them. I mean, there was some slave catching that went on as Lee's army went north, not just at Harper's Ferry, the incident that I mentioned where Confederates talked about it a fair amount. They had talked about it also during the campaign of Second Bull Run. I mean, there's so much to talk about here. June and July are really important moments in terms of of slavery and the war, because it's when both Lincoln and Congress come out with statements saying that slavery's going to end in the Confederacy if the United States triumphs. So it's more on people's minds than it would be generally, but it's still not the main thing on their mind. It's still not the main thing on their minds. There are all kinds of things going on, including the whole war becoming harder in people's minds because of some statements that John Pope made when he was in charge of the Army of Virginia, how he was going to execute Confederates who helped guerrillas and so forth. The war's taking a darker turn in the summer of 1862. Emancipation's part of that from the perspective of Confederates.
Great. And this will be the last question because we're right at time, but I think it's a perfect question to end because it gives you a way to transition between the first presentation you gave for us and this one. Jeff wants to know, why wasn't Gettysburg a turning point in your opinion?
Yeah, I think it wasn't a turning point because nothing really changed because of Gettysburg. I think that Antietam, I mean, Gettysburg's a really big battle. It seems to be the great turning point because of things we know about it now that nobody knew then. Nobody knew it was going to be the biggest and bloodiest battle of the war. Nobody knew it was going to be the last time the Army in Northern Virginia really went into the North. Nobody knew, there are lots of things. Nobody knew it would be the most visited National Park Service site of the Civil War battlefields. So it's just, and before the Gettysburg campaign, the lines are on the Rappahannock riverfront during the Chancellorsville campaign. After the Gettysburg campaign, the lines are along the Rappahannock riverfront in Virginia for the Mine Run campaign, and then for the Wilderness in Spotsylvania. Nothing really changes. People didn't decide Lee wasn't a good general. Lee didn't lose the affection of his soldiers. The Confederate people didn't lose faith in Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. None of those things happened. And Abraham Lincoln was just as disappointed after the Battle of Gettysburg as he was after the Battle of Antietam. He thought George Meade had lost a huge opportunity to deal a real blow to the Confederate Army, and he didn't do it. So I would just argue that nothing really changed because of Gettysburg. It's a big, bloody battle. He lost a third of all his generals there, killed, wounded, and James J. Archer was captured. But he didn't lose a major subordinate dead. It just didn't really change anything in the long term. It's very compelling. It's hugely interesting to read about, but it's not nearly as important as the 7 days. 7 days dramatically changed the course of the war, dramatically. Gettysburg didn't. Antietam changed it more than Gettysburg, not as much as the 7 days did.
Well, thank you. We probably are out of time. I know there was a lot of questions, so we're not going to get to them all, but this is a great point to say that we can continue this conversation in January with your 2-session class. So if anyone would like to sign up for that, I put the link in the chat. You're more than welcome. It is 2 sessions starting in January with Professor Gallagher. And I want to thank you so much. It's so good to have you back.
This was fun. I can't believe the hour is gone already.
I know, it flies by, right? But I want to turn it over to you if you have any closing remarks or final words before we conclude for tonight.
I'll say a couple of things, and since I don't make any money off either one, I can't be accused of anything. Stephen Sears's Landscape Turned Red is still a wonderful book on the Antietam campaign, and Scott Hartwig has a new big book. It's 1,000 pages long, coming out on Antietam from Johns Hopkins University Press later this year. That will be the definitive tactical history of the Antietam campaign. He had an earlier 800-page book on the preliminary part of the campaign. So Scott Hartwig's 2 volumes are the most detailed. Stephen Sears is still came out in the early 1980s, a wonderful overview of the Antietam campaign.
Great. Well, thank you. So basically you're saying I should invite them for a presentation on their book.
I'm just saying that if anybody who's listening wants good books to read about Antietam, those are a couple of good books to read about Antietam.
Perfect. And I will include them in the follow-up email after this presentation. So I'll make sure that everyone has the link for them as well. But thank you so much, Professor Gallagher. It was wonderful. Enjoy your summer. I will see you in January. And I hope all of you joining will see us in January as well. And thank you everyone for joining tonight.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Professor Gallagher. Thank you, everyone.